So welcome everybody to the fifth session in our series on home electrification, put together by the Studio for High Performance Design and Construction. So I'm Kate Stevenson, and we've got Nick Falkoff here from Auburndale Builders. And I'll just kick us off with a quick introduction to the studio, and then we'll dive right into tonight's topic on electric cooking. So the Studio for High Performance Design and Construction is based in Newton. It's a classroom, an educational center for teaching folks, both homeowners and professionals, about energy efficient, high performance building practices. So we're offering a variety of different things. At the moment, all of our programs are online, but we've been offering a series of different webinars and information sessions over the past year or two. And hopefully we'll be getting back to hands-on workshops and in person at some point in the future. So here's a shot of the studio, which is located at the Auburndale Builders headquarters. And you can see some of the previous classes that we've had over the years. And these are tonight's presenters, Nick and I. And some of you, I see some familiar faces, or some names in the participant list, but this is the 5th out of 6 sessions based on home electrification. And so if you're interested, if you missed any of the first couple sessions, we did video record them, so they're available on the Studio for High Performance website. And we have one more session coming up on the 4th of January, which will be on photovoltaics, batteries, and EV charging.
Kate, I have that as the 7th on my calendar.
Okay, well, maybe we'll have to check after that what date was we decided on. So as Nick said, as we came in, we're going to dive right in, but if you have questions, please use the Zoom chat. And I've put everyone on mute. But when we get to the Q&A session at the end, we can have folks come on camera and unmute themselves. But in the meantime, if you have questions as we go along, we'll be checking the chat. All right, so I think we can dive right in. So tonight's topic is specifically around how to electrify your cooking. And that in general, unless you're cooking off of an open wood fire, means getting off of propane and natural gas as your cooking fuel. So tonight we're going to kind of top things we're going to go through: why consider electrification, what are some of the health issues, things to think about when related to range hoods and ventilation. Nick's going to walk us through a little case study of indoor air quality at his house. And then we'll look at kind of what the alternatives are for electric and induction ranges and how to deal with makeup air, and then take any questions that you have at the end. Nick, does that sound good?
Sounds good.
Okay, I'll kick us off. So approximately 1/3 of all houses in the United States cook with natural gas, according to the U.S. Energy Information Association. And honestly, I don't know if that includes propane. I'm up in Vermont. We don't have natural gas, but we do have propane tanks. And so I was kind of I wanted to start us off with, like, why should we even be considering this? I know a lot of people like cooking with gas, but I'm going to give you my biggest pitch on why you should consider electrifying your cooking. And the first one, I think you'll hear about this quite a bit tonight, but it can make you and your kids sick. We'll talk about the health effects. Burning fossil fuels of any kind produces carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. In my opinion, it's an inefficient way to use a non-renewable resource. And also natural gas pipelines in and of themselves leak a lot of methane, which is greenhouse gas, into the atmosphere just through the distribution system because they're old and can often be very leaky. There's also a safety thing, just not having open flames. And when we talk about induction, you'll hear about some of the kind of the safety features of that, where they can just literally take the pan off and the cooktop goes cold. And also for those of us who are kind of on this journey towards electrification, as you start to reduce the number of gas-powered appliances in your home, and if you're down to just the gas range, you may realize like it's kind of getting expensive because you still have to pay for the monthly service fees, even if you're only using like a very small actual amount of gas. So it can become more and more expensive if that becomes, you know, your only use of gas. And one of the interesting things that I've been following recently is this idea that like gas is better and it's like what professionals use and like it's sexier is really the result of like a decades-long advertising campaign from the natural gas industry to make us think that it's like special. And you know, it's so we've been conditioned over our lifetimes to think that this is like the better option. But I think tonight we'll give you a bunch of reasons why you might want to reconsider. So let's talk about the health effects for a second. So when you combust fossil fuels in the middle of your house, you are releasing pollutants into the air. The big ones are nitrogen dioxide and carbon monoxide, right? You probably have a carbon monoxide alarm, you know, or detector in your house. Hopefully you do, but you probably don't have a nitrogen dioxide detector. So often this is just something that no one's really tracking. Homes with gas stoves typically have 50 to 400% higher concentrations of nitrogen dioxide. And the exposure to that really comes down to like effects on your lungs. Children are at increased risk of those effects, increased asthma. You know, this statistic, which is from Rocky Mountain Institute, talks about kids in a home with a gas stove, 42% higher chance of having asthma. And often this risk is like a higher risk for low-income households and when there is no adequate ventilation near the gas stove. So this is why we're talking about range hoods and the importance of ventilation. But as it says, like ventilation on its own cannot fully mitigate these negative health effects. So this just gets at, you know, there are outdoor standards for nitrogen dioxide. This one from the EPA is 100 parts per billion. There actually are no EPA standards for indoor. They just never created them. But we do have like the Canadian and the World Health Organization. So we're talking about 90 to 100 parts per billion as being like, that's the threshold where lots of different groups have seen negative health effects. And then we look down at the bottom here and we say, okay, like at these peak times, it's not just open flame on the stove top, but it's also using gas oven, you know, so baking a cake going up to 230 parts per billion, you know, roasting something in the oven, frying bacon, even just boiling water on the stovetop is exceeding these, you know, recommended levels for outdoor nitrogen dioxide. And again, the reason that kids are most susceptible is, you know, they're, you know, more physically active, so they're breathing more. They have immature respiratory systems. So this is why we're just really concerned about the health effects of gas stoves. So this has been kind of hot topic for me. I've been really like digging deep into this over the last couple of years because I just find it really scary. So if I've scared you a little bit, now I'm going to tell you, okay, what can you do about it even in the short term before you get into electrifying? You know, you're just like, oh my God, what do I do? I have a gas stove. Okay, so what if you have a range hood now? Like, what are the things that you can do right now with your existing range hood just to help mitigate the effects? Turning on the fan every time you use the range, even when you're using the oven, if you have a gas oven, even if you're just boiling water and you're like, it's not smoky, I'm not frying bacon. It's still combustion. You still need to get those pollutants out of your house. If you can, use the back burners because those are much more likely to for the exhaust to be caught by the vent hood. If you have multiple speed settings, turn it all the way up as high as you can go. And leave the fan on after you're finished cooking for about 15 minutes, and that'll just help kind of clear the room out of the exhaust. And then the filters, make sure that you're cleaning the filters. If they get gunked up, they're just not going to work as well. You're not going to be able to get as much exhaust through the fan. So you want to make sure it's working. And then if you're like, darn it, I don't even have a range hood, or my range hood is not working, I think maybe I need a better one or a different one. A few things to think about if you're in the market for buying a range hood. When you buy a stove, there are specifications that come with the stove about what kind of CFM, which is cubic feet per minute, how hefty of a fan do you need to go with that particular stove. So, if you're shopping, you're building a new house and you're just picking out your appliance specs, you can go to the appliance showroom and ask them, okay, if this is the stove I picked, what do I need for a range hood? You want the stove, ideally, you want the hood to be as deep as all the way to the front of the range. P.S. Most of them aren't. Most of the kind of average off-the-shelf ones are not that deep. So, but look, ideally, you want it to go 6 inches on either side. So you want to be capturing, again, as much of the cooking surface as you can. There's all kinds of different models. There are some really fancy modern looking ones that are very flat and thin, but the most effective ones are kind of like an upside down scoop, right? So they're going to collect the exhaust and help bring it up. So kind of and they usually have an angled filter towards the back. Yeah, pay attention to what the rated cubic feet per minute is. Although there's a lot of studies that show whatever it's rated as isn't always exactly the amount of ventilation that you're getting. And then we'll talk about this more at the end. If your house is really tight, you're probably going to need makeup air, which is bringing in fresh air to make up for all the air that you're sucking out with the fan. Because otherwise you have this negative pressure and you have the risk of backdrafting. So we'll talk about that more. And there are a few things coming out of the market. I've been really struggling to find them, but consider the idea of an automatic sensor so that the fan just comes on automatically when you use the stove. And then just a couple other tips about range hoods. If you live in an old house like I do, or you've seen some interesting retrofit strategies, you'll see that often the exhaust doesn't actually go to the outside. Sometimes it's going to the basement, or sometimes it's going to the attic, or sometimes it's going to the laundry room, or who knows exactly where, but you want it to be exhausting all the way to the outside. You've probably seen recirculating range hoods. They're taking the air, they have some kind of grease filter, and then they're throwing it back into the room. When we're talking about dangerous gases coming from the combustion of natural gas or propane in your stove, recirculating hoods is not really going to do a whole lot for you in terms of getting those pollutants out of your house. It may reduce some of the particulates and it's going to get some of the grease out of the air, but it's not going to take water vapor out or any of the nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide. The reason why the water vapor is an issue, you might be just oh, I'm boiling a pot of spaghetti. I'm just I like the humidity, the steam, but that if your humidity is too high and you're really having high levels of humidity from cooking, it can increase mold and mildew dust. When you look at the range hood and you go to install it, like I did when I was fixing up my kitchen, there are also specs about how far off the cooktop the hood should be. Often a lot lower than you think it should be, or you want it to be. So, for it to work the most effectively, it needs to be lower. But, there's some wiggle room there. But just think about that. And also look at the rating for the sound. You know, the number one reason why a lot of people say they never use their range hood is because it's too noisy. So if you don't want to have to deal with that issue of it being too noisy, find one that's quieter. And you'll also occasionally see these downdraft exhausts. So, you know, it either, sometimes they now have these fancy little things where it comes up in the back of the stove, or there's like a downdraft in the middle. You know, it's better than nothing, but they're typically not as effective as a overhead range hood. So again, just kind of, this is just a little graphic that reiterates, but you know, use it every time you cook. Look for a quiet one. Look for one that's bowl shaped. Make sure it's going to the outside. Clean the grease screen. Make sure it covers all the way to the front burners. Cook using the back burners. Those are just kind of like basic strategies to reduce, you know, get the most out of the range hood that you've got. So Nick, tell us about your recent experiment.
Okay, well, before we dive into it, there was one question, so just in the chat box, that does a range hood that does not vent outside help? It filters air. So just want to speak to a minute about what it does filter and what it doesn't filter, you know, because a lot of those recirculating ones.
Yeah, I mean, it filters larger grease particles, and maybe to some extent, like some of them have a charcoal filter, so they might catch some like smoke and soot. So if you were burning something on the stove and, you know, it was filling with smoke, like it would catch some of that. And you know, the charcoal filter can also catch some odor, some cooking odors. But it's not gonna capture any of the gases, the combustion gases.
Okay, I'd be curious to know what how long does the nitrous dioxide last afterwards, and can we get nitrous dioxide sensors, and maybe we could try doing some tests with those.
Mm-hmm.
So
I don't know the answer to that, of like
okay,
how long it stays.
I wrote it down. I'll look it up
in the home.
I'll look it up tomorrow. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through a case study. So we have I currently live in a house that I put a gas stove in 9 years ago because I didn't know any better. And so I'm going to walk you through dinner the other night. So what I did is I have a CO2 sensor that I got on Amazon here. This is about $100. And what we're going to look at is carbon dioxide, and we're going to look at CO2 as a proxy for indoor air quality. So Kate talked about nitrous oxide. I don't have a nitrous oxide detector, dioxide detector, but this will detect high CO2 levels. And so CO2, we want to typically, you know, the atmospheric level is about 400 parts per million, and you know, how good indoor air quality we typically say is below 1,000 parts per million, but you can go up to 1,200. So I'm going to walk you through dinner the other night, and when Katie, my companion, is cooking, what happens in our kitchen, and why did we put in a range hood, and why are we changing out to induction? Because I started watching this and being like, oh, this is really not healthy. Okay, so it's 3:20 p.m. because she's got a long dinner to cook ahead of us, and we're at about 588 because there's two of us in the kitchen. So atmospheric levels in our kitchen with two people might hover in the 500s to 600s. It's not outdoor air quality, which that would read about 400. Okay, next slide, please, Kate.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll go through these kind of quick. So we start out, we've got one burner on. Okay, I started that at 3:25 p.m. and we're at 588. And then you're going to watch how quickly your CO2 levels are going to rise. Okay, so I just started every minute just so you can see that how it starts to, we're doing a little indoor atmospheric test, which is kind of the future of where our world is going, but we'll play this out in the kitchen. Okay, next slide, please. So at 3:36, I turned on a second burner, okay, because this is a very common meal. Katie will have a big pot going and then a sauce pot going on the back. And watch what's happening here is that our numbers are starting to jump up in faster increments, right? We're going from 6:30 to 6:40 to 6:37. And what are we in? We're 15 minutes into this meal. 6:41, she can turn on the oven because she has to preheat the oven, okay? And now we're going to start to see even bigger jumps in parts per million, even just within a minute, how fast this is going to go. Now, I know where this is going, so I'm not going to push the levels, but if you don't ever monitor cooking, what you'll see is that these levels are going to get really high, really fast in your kitchen. And she's standing right next to the range. So at 3:48, our cats are watching and they're wondering what is going on here. It is 3:48. I'm boiling water in the pots, and already up to 759. So 800 parts per million is where we start to say is where we, you know, we start to get a little concerned. We don't want to get above, you know, between 800 and 1,000. It's okay, but it's not really good air quality. And, you know, this isn't like I'm not cooking 4 burners here and I don't have the oven on 550. So we're starting to get up there. It's 3:50, so we're now 25 minutes into this meal, which is, you know, pretty early into cooking a meal. And we're at 7:54. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, so now I know we're going to get above 800. So this is where I turn on our vent hood because I don't want bad air quality in our kitchen, and Katie spends a lot of time cooking. So I turn it on high at 354, but if you'll notice, we're really starting to saturate the CO2 and probably nitrous dioxide in the room. And so the levels keep rising all the way through because we've saturated this room, okay? So if you've never monitored this, I tell a lot of people, you think you might be tired because it's the end of the day or because you're tired of hearing about the pandemic, but when you're standing your stove, but this stove is really putting a lot of CO2, and CO2 makes you drowsy. So this stove is going to Habitat for Humanity next week, so I didn't really clean it up. Sorry, it's a little dirty. Okay, one of our cats, June, is pretty bored. She's watching me roll around on the floor because she's bored in the kitchen. So Katie needs to cook dinner now, so I need to get out of the way. And so she turns off both the burners. The oven's still on and the fan is still on, but look at our PPM. It's still rising because that oven is now cranking out heat. And so we're at 4 o'clock, so we're half an hour into our meal. We're at 930 ppm. We're getting up where we don't want to be with high, you know, CO2 levels, and our cats are doing what they do. Let's go to the next slide. So this, oh, sorry, I didn't turn the. Oh, I got a slide out of order. Sorry.
Maybe they're out of order. Yeah.
Sorry about that. So I turned the hood on around 800 ppm, and it keeps rising all the way through the meal. So we'll keep going.
Yeah, here we go.
Okay, now she's cooking dinner. Okay, she's got the pork chops in the pot, and we're at 936, right? And this is why we want induction, right? Because we've got the hood on full, and it's blasting air out of this kitchen, and the levels are going to keep going up and over 1,000, even on full, because there's such a saturation of CO2 in the room. Okay, so at 425, and it starts to come down. If you notice, by 425, it stops rising, and at 430, it starts to drop again. And our cat is wondering about her cognitive function. That's June. So, you know, if I wasn't monitoring this and I didn't know where this was going, the average person who's cooking, you know, at you know, it's 450. So we've been cooking now for what? That's been a little over an hour around then. If you're cooking for like a few hours at a time, which is very normal, or you've got a few dishes going, or you have a lot of people in that kitchen, these CO2 levels would probably get up over 2,000. So we're going to put a bunch of links in the chat box to share with people about the CO2 levels and why this is not good and how does it affect your cognitive function. Let's go to the next slide, Kate. So we have some alternatives, right? We don't have to have gas. I put it in because I didn't know any better. We can look at electric, just regular electric ranges, right? Which are glass cooktops with or an electric coil. And then there's induction ranges. So if you're not familiar with induction cooktops use electromagnetic. They change the magnetic orientation of the molecules in your cast iron pans like many times a second, and they heat up the surface by changing the direction of the magnetic friction. I don't know how that works, but it works. And we have these they're super efficient. You can put your hand on the glass next to them. They don't get they only react to the pan. It doesn't react with the glass surface or anything else. So one of the benefits is it's super efficient. It's all electric. If people who have started to cook with these, they're becoming increasingly popular with chefs and like people who know, because you get absolute temperature control. You can set each burner to a specific temperature. You're not playing with the gas dial. So induction is becoming much more common. IKEA sells them now as well. We're getting a Bosch one. I don't know if there's any questions on how induction works. This is the one we're putting in. It's a cooktop and an oven. They're a little bit pricey, but based on what I've looked at for the health stuff, like it's a no-brainer for our perspective.
Yeah. This is one that I just put in a project, which I think is one of the, you know, less expensive ones, the Frigidaire. But yeah, you can see it's just got the kind of flat gas cooktop. But there are all kinds of different kinds. There's one that's double oven. I mean, you just go to any appliance showroom, you can see a variety of induction styles. And then you got the George Foreman Nick.
Yeah, we have one of these at our office. So people think for outdoor cooking, we have an electric grill outside, so you can grill and barbecue. You don't have to use gas. You don't have to fire up. So one of our guys have it. And how much power someone's asking how much power do they use? They use, like, I think it's like a 40 amp circuit, you know, or depending on the unit size. This George Foreman one, we just plug into a regular wall outlet. Yeah. These little cooktops. So I have one of these at the studio too. These are about $100, $120. I cook on this with a cast iron frying pan. So if you want just like something fast and easy, I actually have like 3 of these. We have them like our job sites for the guys to heat up stuff with. They're really fast, really cheap, and they're, you know, it's $100. You can put it on your counter and boil your water, or, you know, especially if you're going to be cooking something for a long period of time, they're good.
I added this in because I thought this was cool. I'm on a Facebook group that's called Electrify Everything, and it's a bunch of nerds who are interested in electrification. But this guy was like, yeah, I rent my apartment. I can't just go and buy a new stove. And he got a butcher block top to just go on top of the stove with 2 induction hot plates. I thought that was a pretty cool hack.
Yeah,
but it's a great way, you know, as Nick said, it's a great low cost way. If you're like, I'm not sure about this whole induction thing, I just want to try it out, you know, for $100, $150, you can get one of these little hot plates that might do the trick, you know, 75% of the time, when you just need to do one thing. So
yeah, Wirecutter does review them, and they do make a dual burner one. I have one of those. There's a dual, so and they don't need any special wiring. You can just plug it into your regular kitchen outlet, and they run off of that.
So you want to talk about makeup air, Nick?
Okay. Yeah, there was a question about how much energy they use. So I said standard appliance energy. Can you use stainless steel pots? If a magnet sticks to it, then it'll work with induction. If a magnet doesn't stick to it, which I don't believe stainless magnets, it won't stick. It won't do it. So like cast iron, basically it has to be magnetic. So
yeah. So copper pots will not work. Yeah. So you may have to switch out your pots. Or some of them anyway, but like a, you know, an enameled steel, like a Le Creuset kind of pot will work, cast iron, or any kind of steel.
Yep. And there was one other question about the dual burner. I looked on Wirecutter, and they rated those Duxtop, DUXTOP. That's like a good one, and they're fairly inexpensive. I think the dual burner is like $160 or something, but they're pretty cheap. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about makeup air, just because this is something that gets done wrong a lot, and I've done a fair amount of looking into it when we build our houses. How do we do makeup air correctly? Like, what's the best way? And most people aren't going to do this, but if you're considering building new or remodeling your kitchen, I'm going to talk about when we bring in air. So when we take out, say, 400 CFM or cubic feet per minute, so any range that requires 400 CFM or more, you need to bring in makeup air. You can't just take out 400 cubic feet a minute out of your kitchen and not bring it in to balance the house. Otherwise, you could backdraft some of your appliances. So if you're considering a new stove, a gas stove, or you know, which I would tell you not to do, but if you are going to do it, you need to bring in makeup air and talk to your appliance vendor about the makeup air kit. So what we do is we take out 400 CFM. We need to bring in 400 CFM so we don't depressurize the house and backdraft things. So you'll have, you know, there's a few components. You have the range hood itself, which takes the air out. And then you have another system that is connected to with a relay switch that basically, when you turn on that hood, it brings in the air somewhere else. It opens up a damper and air flows into the kitchen. So, you know, some of our clients really want gas, and we're building airtight, like passive house or net zero houses. And we say, that's fine. You will do the gas because that's what you want. But you have to do a makeup air system, and then we'll get into some of the details. So let's go to the next slide. So Building Science Corp is they're experts in all sorts of building science stuff. This link, which you'll be able to have access to, is a great article on how to do it properly. But in general, what we're looking for is called is we call it a push-pull system. We want 2/3 of the makeup air coming in near the hood, okay? And about 1/3 is brought in away from the hood. And what this does is we create a positive pressure away from the hood and a negative pressure at the hood, and that's going to get us the best capture rate. So a lot of times you see people bring in the makeup air, you know, and it's you don't want the fumes going up and getting around that hood. So let's go to the next slide, Kate. So consideration. So if you're going to do a gas range or you're going to do a big exhaust hood, say you put an induction, but you want to get rid of the smell. Some people fry a lot or they grill a lot indoors. They're not worried about the CO2 because we're not combusting a gas appliance, but they want to get the smells out of the house or the smoke out. So you need to bring in a lot of air, and that can be cold. So if you're cooking when it's 20 degrees outside and you're bringing in, say, 400 or 600 or 800 CFM into your kitchen, you don't want to just dump that around the cook because you'll get cold, right? So how do you do this? So on this diagram, it's showing 2/3 of the air coming in at the feet of the foot of the range. We don't actually recommend doing it right at where the range is, because if you're standing there cooking, you'll feel a draft and it'll feel cold. So Dan Colbert is another builder up in Portland, Maine. And what he does is he'll bring in some of that air and he'll dump it in behind the refrigerator. So your refrigerator is naturally trying to get cold using the coil. And so like the fridge is often like, just a few feet away from the range. And then you'll have a little vent panel. On our job, we're putting vent panels. So we're using Dan's idea. We're dumping that cold air behind the fridge where it gets warmed up a little bit by the coil. And then we'll put a grill on the side of the fridge panel so the air can flow through to the range. So that's sort of like our away location. We'll either put it up above the fridge or somewhere where it's not direct current or draft across the person who's cooking. And then in the next slide, Kate, if you go to the next one, we try not to bring the air right up at the foot of the stove. Well, actually, on this job, we made a custom vent and we brought up the air behind the range, so you don't feel that cold air coming up. You're cooking, but that makeup air, that stainless steel grate going across the back, that's where our makeup air is coming in. So we've got good balanced ventilation. We're getting the air, the air where we want it, and it's not going to make somebody cold. So something to think about. You don't want to say, oh, I bought this big gas range and I can cook for 6 people, and then you're dumping, yeah. And the other option is you have to put a preheater. You can reheat the air it comes in, but you're basically running a big toaster oven. It's super energy inefficient. It takes as much energy as like your whole heating system in your house. So it's expensive to run. It's not good for the environment. And we try not to use preheaters unless the clients really want them. Opening a window, yeah, you could open a window, but typically we're trying to when we build our homes, we just want our clients to just be able to cook and turn on their hood and not have to open windows. So if you live in a house,
I think that's like option of last resort. If you really have no other option, open a window, but it's not going to again capture the gases in a way like a hood does. And there's someone else just said, are you saying that even with if you went for induction, do you still need a vent hood? And my answer is yes, because you're still going to be wanting to exhaust you're still going to have the grease, the particulates, if anything burns, you're going to have the odors that you're going to want to exhaust. So I still recommend always having ventilation, even with a induction or an electric range.
Yeah, and something else, Lawrence Berkeley Labs did some studies on sometimes the particulate matter of food breaking down can actually be not healthy as well. So like when you're frying, you're cooking with oil. So if you want to look up, if you Google Lawrence Berkeley Labs indoor air quality of cooking, they've done like tons of research. So there is the CO2 concern. There's also sometimes you've got stuff that as food breaks down, it's not good particulates. Like yeah. Okay. And then there are some risks for ventilation without makeup air. So let's just say you open your window, right, to vent your 800 CFM. You don't want to create a negative pressure where you're backdrafting. You don't want to pull, the air will follow the path of least resistance. And if you put in a big hood and you don't do the makeup air, you could pull air down a fireplace and pull soot in, or your water heater might not draft and you could pull those fumes in, or your boiler could backdraft. So, if you open your window, are you going to get the right pressure? Will it work? It could create a negative pressure, and it could be pulling air from you don't want to. So if you live in an old leaky house that's like 13 or 10 air changes, like I live in a fairly leaky house, I'm slowly fixing, it doesn't really matter as much. But if you live in a newer house that's like 3 air changes or less, you want to be conscientious about having balanced ventilation. These are 2 air quality monitors that we bought. We gave them to 2 Green Newton students to do some research, and then we're going to be donating them to the library of the Newton Library of Things. So if you want to try monitoring CO2 or particulate matter in your own house, these will be available at the Newton Library. We'll probably donate them in like January, and you can take these monitors and you can move them around your house and you can sort of see how your CO2 levels are. So like These ones are battery powered. You can even bring it in your car and see how high your CO2 levels get in your car. But if you're interested, yeah, they'll be at the library soon, and we'll have some instructions. And we're asking people to send in their reports. Like, we create a part of our website in the studio where you can report what are you seeing for your CO2 levels. I don't know if the students have been filling out much. I got to follow up with Mike DeClo. He's supposed to be tracking the students. So any other questions on ventilation? These are all resources to links, all about air quality and what it does to your cognitive function and why you want to ventilate, get good ventilation.
Yeah, and we're gonna, after this, we'll post the slides and the recording on the studio website, studiohpdc.org. Yes, and then, yeah, but this is pretty much the presentation. So if we do have other questions, you can either put them in the chat or you can turn your video on and come on and ask. Nick, there's one on any opinion on air purifiers?
I think it really depends. So when we talk about good air quality, we're typically picking one part of what's in the air we want to measure. So I talked about CO2, Kate talked about nitrous dioxide. Katie, my girlfriend, works in a pottery studio. So like each air purifier you want to consider is what are you concerned with and what are you looking for? So in a pottery studio, I'm worried about microparticles, right, from clay dust. When you're cooking with gas, you're worried about nitrous dioxide. When you're just having a big gathering with a lot of people, you might just want to look at CO2. So like in our classroom, we monitor CO2. So air purifiers, I think it depends on what are you trying to get out of the air. So are you trying to get, and what do you, so pure in terms of purification, like, yeah, so what is your target? And so if you can tell me what you're worried about, then we can say what you might consider as a way to mitigate that. I
can say, so like I said, I'm up in Vermont, and after railing about gas stoves, I have to make like admission that I burn wood in my house. I burn with a wood stove. So I actually got an air purifier, just a portable one, because mainly I was worried about the particulates from the wood stove. But it is really interesting because when it's on, you just kind of leave it on auto setting, so it's just constantly sensing. And occasionally, like if I open the door of the wood stove and throw some logs in, like that will trigger it to ramp up to high. But more often, it's as soon as we start cooking in the kitchen. And this is in the living room, so it's like the other room in the kitchen, like as soon as you start doing anything on the stove, it automatically is going into high gear. And that's with an electric stove. So it's not, we're not talking about, gas stove particulates, but it's just the, like we said, the cooking particulates. So I don't know how much it's really doing, but it's very interesting to see how it responds to these different changes in the environment.
Yeah, there's a question about an IQ Air Visual Pro. That one costs about $260. That's a pretty good one. The benefit of the IQ Visual Pro versus the one I showed at the beginning of the presentation is that the IQ Air Visual Pro data log, so you can leave it in a room. So when you go to sleep at night, if you wanted to monitor, and it'll track, so you can look back and see what the peak was over the night, Catherine. So like if you leave it in a space, and you can upload the data if you want. So say you wanted to track long-term, like a classroom, or you wanted to say, how is Mike, yeah, so that's one of the benefits of it. There's a question, Kate, on induction ranges. If it's so efficient, why do they need a 40 amp 240? Is it just for resistance for the oven? Do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I don't know, but I do assume that it has to do with the oven because, regular electric range needs 240. But yeah, I don't know for sure. Yeah, the oven itself is not an induction oven. The oven is just an element, and it's the induction cooktop. The cooktop is super efficient, and and also when I say efficient, if you take a gas pot, a pot of water, and you try to boil it, a lot of that heat is just curling up around the pot and going and dissipating into the space. Or with an induction, you're just heating the actual metal element itself, so you don't have all that heat that's radiating off. So what's interesting with induction, if you're cooking in the summer, you're not going to heat the whole room up due to the inefficiency. So it does have a big electrical draw, but it's still efficient. Yeah. Is there a standard? There's a question on standard test for burner efficiency on stoves. So, Tom, what is the efficiency question? You mean like for how much energy you're getting out of it, or what are you looking for with efficiency of it? Maybe.
You can also, people can unmute too if they want to chime in. You know, our presentation is done, so if there's any questions, we can just field them.
Can you hear me?
Yep. Yep.
Okay. My question is, there are standard efficiency tests that were developed by the Department of Energy for rating burners on stoves. I've been curious as to know what the data comparison is for electric, standard electric type stove cooktops, induction cooktops, and gas cooktops. I haven't seen any data. Do you have it?
No.
No, you might check Consumer Reports. They might look at it, or I'm not sure who would rate. I don't know who does that. You know, I don't even know what an Energy Star would be for like a gas stove. I don't even think I've ever even heard of it. So
They
I don't know.
Yeah, Energy Star doesn't rate stoves at all.
I'm curious because I always, when I see these things, I just wonder if anybody's looking at the energy cost, I mean, the CO2 cost, going back to the cost of the generation comparisons of the amount of electricity that's being used, say, in an induction unit. Yeah, it looks like it might be, it's neat, but when you trace things back to the origin and compare the CO2 loads from the different fuels, are we really reducing the CO2 loads?
Well, Tom, I can speak to that a little bit, and I think it's maybe a good place for us to kind of wrap up, because it brings us back to what we talked about in one of the first sessions, which is just like, why are we talking about electrification, right? And why are we talking about electrification as a response to climate change? And it's because, you know, even though, you know, you could say, depending on where you are in the country, you know, the grid, some parts of the grid are cleaner and more renewable than others. You know, some parts are still burning coal to produce electricity, which has, you know, high greenhouse gas emissions. And in those scenarios, you know, you can argue that natural gas might be less carbon, you know, less total emissions, but our grid is very rapidly electrifying. Well, our grid is becoming more and more renewable, right? So we are closing down coal plants. We are switching, you know, some electricity is produced with natural gas, but more, you know, year over year is getting more renewable with wind and solar. And so, you know, I think that's part of like the overall reason is, even if today in Newton, Massachusetts, it may not be, you know, I don't know exactly what the mix is when you compare electric versus gas and the carbon emissions. But if we look ahead over the next 20, 30 years, and how we're going to meet our greenhouse gas emission targets, we really need to be looking to electrification, because that's really like the only renewable option. So I don't know, you know, if that exactly answers your question, but that is kind of the bigger picture, why we're talking about switching over heating systems, why we're talking about switching to electric vehicles, you know, the whole point of this series.
You know, that's what I was thinking too, that it's really looking into the future rather than the short term for these things to be effective. And it really only is going to be really cutting back on the CO2 once we get the electricity generated by renewable resources that are non-CO2.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, here in Vermont, like we're already at 65% renewable in terms of our electricity mix. You know, that's up from like 20% 10 years ago. So it's rapidly changing, and they're projecting it's going to be 100% before 2030. Yeah, and like as you said in the chat, in Newton, you can sign up for 100% renewable electricity as an option today. So, you know, it is possible, and it's happening fast. Well, any last questions, or should we wrap up? So we've got one more session. We'll confirm whether it's January 4th or January 7th, but we're going to kind of talk about the last pieces of this electrification puzzle. What to consider if you're looking at photovoltaics, either on your house or through a community solar project. battery, which is, energy storage within your home as an alternative to a generator or, for backup power. And we'll talk about what you need to think about in terms of EV charging if you are getting an electric vehicle or two, where you need to think about installing the chargers and what to plan for that.
Thank you for joining us. Thanks, Kate.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Good night.